This is fun. I probably should have had one of these on for the last 2 years of Zooming. Instead, I just winged it. All right. Thank you all for being here tonight. I had originally intended to create a PowerPoint that had some pictures of some of the figures that I was going to be talking about tonight. But after 2 years of creating really kind of countless Zoom style and hybrid lectures, I thought, no, I'm just going to talk and hope that that will keep you kind of connected. The other thing about tonight's talk is I am speaking about an era that's now over a half century in the past. At the time of the Stonewall riots, phrases like gay and lesbian were very common ways to describe what we now recognize as a much broader community. And words like trans or the longer transgender were less accessible. So like the word transgender really didn't even exist at the time. Terms like transsexual and transvestite were common terms, but there was also a great deal of sort of grouping people who we would identify as trans and non-binary into just a gay community. So when I talk about the Stonewall Inn, it was a gay bar. That would be the correct reference to the actual site at the time. I'm also, in a contemporary sense, going to talk about an LGBTQ plus movement and rights and community. I'm going to do my best to kind of keep these terms separate, but there's a little bit of blending together just because I didn't want to spend the whole time trying to like go down the long rabbit hole of where all these terms are historically coming from. Simultaneously, I'm trying to be cognizant of not ascribing an identity to somebody that would be historically accurate. So I'll do my best with that as we go forward. It might be worth time when we get to a Q&A to talk about some of that based on sort of the comments I want to make. But to really get started, I would be remiss this evening not to start this talk by acknowledging actually very recent history, the Supreme Court ruling from just last Friday in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. The title of my talk tonight is Stonewall and Beyond. And though my focus is the events surrounding the Stonewall uprising from June of 1969 and its meaning for contemporary LGBTQ plus rights movement, rights for LGBTQ plus people are intimately related to the premise of Roe v. Wade, Griswold v. Connecticut, Loving v. Virginia, and frankly, all civil rights cases that are based on the legal principle we call substantive due process. In the late 1960s, members of the LGBTQ plus community became a notable, visible presence in political protest, demanding basically, as they would say at the time, equality for homosexual citizens. That was a fairly common picket sign that you would see. Several organizations, most notably the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, spearheaded efforts to gain rights for gay and lesbian citizens at a time when open displays of affection between same-sex couples, intimate sexual acts between same-sex couples, and cross-dressing in public were treated as actual crimes. However, these efforts were always in conversation with the other civil rights and anti-war protest movements of the era. Many of the early activists for LGBTQ plus rights were directly involved in protest for other marginalized groups and minority groups. These different groups did not always see eye to eye on tactics, especially among LGBT rights groups. There was actually a great deal of animosity from those groups directed at, say, the National Organization for Women, or NOW, or the group the Black Panthers, because those groups actually harbored some pretty substantial anti-queer sentiments. Also, gay rights activists were generally always angry at how few straight people would show up for gay rights activism, even as gay rights activists became deeply involved in other protest movements. But moving forward, to an extent, the meaning of Stonewall has evolved over time into the origin story for a specific LGBTQ plus rights movement to achieve marriage equality, which was finally recognized on June 26, 2015, the historic Obergefell v. Hodges decision that found same-sex marriage to be a fundamental right predicated on substantive due process and the equal protections clauses of the 14th Amendment. Believe it or not, there were actually some gay rights organizations that after Obergefell began to disband under the presumption that equality had been attained. So what was the point of even fighting for stuff anymore? It took very little time for trans people to speak up, to remind gay and lesbian activists that marriage equality was absolutely not the end goal of the movement founded upon the Stonewall uprising. And it took even less time for the forces that oppose equality generally to shift targets and pursue increasingly shocking regulations against trans lives, efforts that are quite obviously still underway even today. Then just last Friday, in a concurring opinion authored by Justice Clarence Thomas in the decision to reverse Roe v. Wade, Thomas explicitly stated that, quote, in future cases, we should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold and Obergefell, end quote. So as I speak to you this evening, the equality most explicitly linked to the uprising at Stonewall is right now under direct threat, and we should take nothing for granted. In the dissenting opinion, the court's 3 liberal justices said, quote, no one should feel confident that the majority of the court is done with its work, end quote. But tonight, in the spirit of Stonewall, I would add, nor are we. All right, now to Stonewall. Sylvia Rivera's version of the story starts with Judy Garland. Rivera was a 17-year-old cross-dresser and sex worker, a street kid, who frequented the gay bars in Lower Manhattan, including the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village. The Stonewall Inn catered to an eclectic, albeit working-class crowd of drag queens, hustlers, gay men, and occasionally lesbians. Though almost all the other gay bars in New York City at the time, it was run by the mob, it was subject to pretty regular police raids, and it was hardly known as an upscale establishment. Run as a so-called private bottle club to skirt the requirements for having a liquor license. The clientele was required to sign in at the door, and Judy Garland, along with Donald Duck and Elizabeth Taylor, was a regular nom de plume provided by the queer people who frequented the bar, but who were also still very much on the legal and social margins of American life. But this evening was different. So Rivera didn't want to go out at all when her friend Marsha P. Johnson invited her out to party that night. But then the news of the day on Friday, June 27th, 1969, had been all about the 20,000 mourners in the city who attended the public viewing and visitation for Garland, who had died just 5 days before. For a generation of LGBTQ plus people, movies and television offered few positive stories of living a different, better, open life. But Garland's vocal performance of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, from the 1939 film Wizard of Oz, that's a recording now. I'm going to get flack from that clip for you just said. In the 1939 film Wizard of Oz, gave many people a fleeting hope for what a better world could be like, where maybe being gay would be accepted, even if just in one's imagination. In fact, to call oneself a friend of Dorothy, after the protagonist of that film had emerged as a hood of acknowledging one's belonging to a community that we now celebrate with flags, strings of letters that a whole half-century or more queer Americans could hardly have even dreamed about. And now Garland was gone. So Rivera allowed the grandeur of the moment to persuade her. She headed over to the Stonewall Inn. Mark Segal, a young gay man who was also at the bar that night, would later refute that Garland's death had anything to do with what happened in the early morning hours of 28th, by the way. Happy Stonewall Day. This is actually the anniversary of the uprising. Mark Segal would say, quote, the biggest fallacy of Stonewall is when people say, of course they were upset. Judy Garland was being buried that day. That trivializes what happened in our years of oppression and is just culturally wrong. Calling Somewhere Over the Rainbow nothing more than wishful thinking, Segal would even claim, quote, that we were going to smash that rainbow. We didn't have to go over anything or travel anywhere to get what we wanted. The riot was about the police doing what they constantly did, indiscriminately harassing us. The police represented every institution in America that night. Religion, media, medical, legal, even our families, most of whom had been keeping us at our place. We were tired of it. And as far as we knew, Judy Garland had nothing to do with it. I'm here this evening to talk about the Stonewall uprising, a series of protests and riots that occurred at the Stonewall Inn beginning in the early morning of June 28, 1969, and stretching over the following days. In his second inaugural address, then President Barack Obama declared that we, as a nation, are bound together by what he called, quote, the most evident of truths, that all of us are created equal, end quote. He said this truth is, quote, the star that guides us, just as it guided our forebears through Seneca Falls, to Selma, to Stonewall. He thus became the first president to acknowledge the history of the LGBTQ+ rights movement in an inaugural address. And he did so by placing our movement squarely in a broader American history of social progress, the women's rights movement, which he represented by pointing to its kind of at least mythic origins at the Seneca Falls Convention all the way back in 1848, and the African-American civil rights movement, which he represented by pointing to the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965. Okay, anyone who knows anything about the history of women's rights or the long and turbulent history of racial disparity and efforts for equality in this country surely knows that there's no one moment that can epitomize the entire. But it can be nice to find an origin, a place and time in history to point to and say that this is where we started, where we first came together to begin the progress we've made today. Or this moment was the crux, the fulcrum around which pivoted the change that makes a better world. As a gay person, I was deeply moved by the president's inclusion of my history in his address. And indeed, Stonewall is often credited as this giant aha moment of what we now call the LGBTQ+ rights movement, which, to get back to terms, at the time was generally referred to as gay liberation. As again, the term transgender was not really in use at the time, though other terms signified what we now think is trans, and other terms I think can be safely used backwards to identify other groups involved. But as a scholar, I also wanted to know what exactly happened at Stonewall to make it this sacred moment in our movement, and why did Stonewall then become so important? And maybe combining these two selves, as a member of the LGBTQ community who is also a scholar, I wanted to know what exactly does Stonewall even mean? Because honestly, I came out of the closet at 16 back in 1998. Do the math there, yes, 40 years old. Okay, I'm better. I was plugged into the news. I was also a good student, so of course I wanted to know about my history and thought I had some understanding of what had occurred in the past. I've always wanted to fight for the rights of people like me to live in this world with more than just casual tolerance. And I built that desire off the belief that surely there were others who had fought for us too in the past, and we can be proud of that and can know about it. But I had barely heard of Stonewall prior to graduate school, where I was actively studying LGBTQ+ literature and history. Though admittedly, during my undergraduate days, our Gay Straight Alliance did get together for a movie night where we watched this very campy 1995 BBC version of a film called Stonewall. And okay, we may or may not have been entirely sober while we were watching this film, but I will say it did not leave me with the impression that Stonewall was centrally important, even as sort of its campy glitziness has absolutely stayed with me all of these years. And I would also point out, I'm pretty sure you can watch this version of the Stonewall film for free on Amazon Prime if you have an account now. I'll get you forward later. So this evening, I'm tackling these questions about Stonewall and its movie as a way to honor Pride. My goal this evening is to talk about what historians and eyewitnesses say actually happened that night at Stonewall and in the ensuing days of unrest on Christopher Street. But I also want to explore why Stonewall has grown to be such an important touchstone for LGBTQ+ people, and the ways that that status has caused some of the real history to become obscured by legends and myth. Stonewall matters. I'm not challenging that premise tonight. But for whom and as what are not things that we readily agree on yet. So let's start with the basic timeline of events. Dick Leash was a local gay rights activist who witnessed the initial riot on June 28th and the subsequent protesting throughout the following days. He wrote a flash account of it titled "The Hairpin Drop Around the World" immediately after the uprising and distributed that publication through an established channel of gay publications pioneered by his organization, the Mattachine Society, and also with the help of a friend named Craig Rodwell, who had founded and ran the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookstore near the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. According to Leash, quote, plainclothes officers entered the club at around 2 a.m., armed with a warrant, and closed the place on grounds of illegal selling of alcohol. Employees were arrested and customers told to leave. The patrons gathered on the street outside and were joined by other residents of Greenwich Village and visitors to the area. The police behaved, as is usually the case when they deal with homosexuals, with bad grace, and were reproached by straight onlookers. Pennies were thrown at the cops by the crowd, then beer cans, rocks, and even parking meters. The cops retreated inside the bar, which was set afire by the crowd. A hose from the bar was employed by the trapped cops to douse the flames, and reinforcements were summoned. A melee ensued with nearly 1,000 persons participating, as well as several hundred cops. Nearly 2 hours later, the cops secured the area, end quote. 2 reporters, neither openly gay, also wrote accounts for the Village Voice at the time, and the Village Voice may now be considered a very left-leaning queer newspaper. At the time, it was very much not a queer-friendly publication. Chief reporter Howard Smith found himself trapped inside the bar with the cops, and he reported that the officers trapped inside the bar actually did seriously consider using deadly force before those reinforcements arrived outside the bar, in the form of the Tactical Police Force, a division of the 6th Precinct, specifically there to do riot control. It's sad that there are probably contemporary correlations to these types of special forces still belonging to police forces today. Lucian Truscott IV, who is very much still alive and now a regular contributor to Salon.com, if anybody happens to read that website very often, described the sometimes humorous, sometimes angry reaction of the growing crowd outside of the bar as he watched the situation escalate from the exterior of the Stonewall. Only 13 people were arrested that night, including 7 employees. However, the bar would then open the next night, largely because being a private bottle club, it could operate with very little formal infrastructure. What was not explicitly revealed in any published accounts was a full assessment of the beatings and other confrontations between queer people and police. Much occurred, but without formal arrest warrants. Not a whole lot of paperwork or print records detail the many confrontations from that night. In the dark and increasingly crowded streets, what really happened in the melee that Leash describes has largely been recounted only as oral history and later published eyewitness accounts. Leash, Smith, and Truscott also described the events that followed. The bar reopened the next night. As I said, patrons returned, and then the police arrived to keep the peace. Additional confrontations ensued over the following 3 or 4 days before rainy weather swept in, calming the situation just in time for Independence Day. Okay, so far I've actually been hedging just a little bit in how I'm describing these events. Was it a riot, or an uprising, or a spontaneous street protest? In popular culture, the events at the Stonewall Inn are often called a riot, but as recent events in the United States, particularly associated with Black Lives Matter, demonstrate, riot can be a troubling and sometimes pejorative term meant to make something seem more violent than it was. Does it suggest chaos and unlawful disorder? Or does it just mean a spirited reaction, spearheaded by otherwise marginalized communities? Because, as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, a riot is the language of the unheard. Scholars tend to lean towards uprising because to say protest feels maybe a bit like we are describing something that was planned by a committee in advance, whereas an uprising feels like it describes something much more spontaneous. The events that occurred at Stonewall were, in the moment on June 28th, completely spontaneous. No one went to the bar that night looking to pick a fight with the police. However, the subsequent days of uprising were very much planned by local gay rights advocates who recognized that the spontaneous uprising on the morning of June 28th could be used as a rallying cry for continued organized resistance. Those advocates were intuitively sensing that this time, this police raid and the resistance to it were different They made Stonewall into something more than just a one-night spontaneous event. One of the most obvious myths about Stonewall is that it was the first significant uprising or riot or protest, or call it what you will, for gay rights. Dick Leash actually opened his report that hairpin dropped around the world by saying, quote, "The first gay riots in history took place in the pre-dawn hours of June 28th in New York City," end quote. Regardless of what actually took place, it should be called a riot. It was absolutely not the first time the LGBTQ community had fought back. But here's where the meaning of Stonewall starts to get complicated. This is where Stonewall starts to change from an account of an event that occurred to being something bigger. It becomes a story we tell, a story full of meaning, more than just simple journalism or objective facts can necessarily paint. To be clear, the Stonewall Riot, Stonewall uprising, Stonewall protest was not the first uprising, riot, protest, or otherwise involving LGBTQ people fighting for our rights. Susan Stryker, a trans historian, outlines at least 3 significant protests prior to Stonewall, including a riot at Cooper's Donuts in Los Angeles in 1959, an organized sit-in at Dewey's Diner in Philadelphia in 1965, and the Compton Cafeteria riots in San Francisco in 1966. The Compton Cafeteria riots in particular have taken significant efforts by historians to document because it was not covered in the press and very few police records exist for it. We don't even know on what date it actually occurred, just August of 1966. None of these, nor many other significant acts of activism, had been heralded like Stonewall, which has become over time the story we tell about the emergence of a public, visible movement for LGBTQ+ rights. However, even for Stonewall, after the initial reporting on the uprising, relatively few attempts seem to have been made to write one singular substantive history of why the uprising occurred and how it influenced gay rights efforts in that moment, though there were regular references to it that appeared in memoir accounts published by people directly involved in gay liberation activism in New York City, as well as in oral history projects recorded over subsequent years. It wouldn't be until 1993 in his book Stonewall, see, I did bring vision. In his book Stonewall, that historian Martin Duberman would attempt to compose a full history of the events leading up to the Stonewall uprising, starting in the 1940s, actually. New York City had long been home to queer populations. In his seminal work of history, Gay New York, George Chauncey charted the history of mostly gay male communities in the city from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. However, by the 1940s, after World War II, America entered a particular reactionary period that combined capitalism and patriotism. Threats like communists and homosexuals became easy targets for right-wing reproach. Laws regulating, if not outright outlawing, what we think of as LGBTQ+ life existed in every state by 1960. Even large cities like Philadelphia and Chicago only had relatively small, less well-organized queer communities, but New York City had maintained a relatively large, open gay culture, especially in neighborhoods like Greenwich Village, that attracted thousands of young people from all over the country, seeking shelter and safety for their sense of queer inclination. And by the way, here's where I point out 1960 novels like Beetle Drinker by Anne Bannon, all the way up to things like The Hours by Michael Cunningham. The sheer number of like protagonists of gay novels who grew up on dairy farms in Wisconsin and moved to New York to escape is really high. And I just, maybe that's a separate talk. Okay. Duberman's book tells the story of how a handful of organizations formed in the 1950s and 60s, dedicated to what they called at the time the homophile movement. Two of these organizations include my aforementioned National Society, with most of its membership being gay men, and the Daughters of Philotis, a group focused mostly on lesbian equality. Duberman then uses a story of 6 specific individuals born into the post-war baby boom who became involved in homophile activism in the 1960s in New York. 3 of whom, by the way, were white gay men, 2 were lesbians. One is the aforementioned Sylvia Rivera, whom Duberman aligns with gay male identity, but whose gender expression is now commonly presumed to relate to trans identities. However, only 3 of the subjects, including Rivera, were anywhere near the Stonewall Inn on June 28th. It seems that both lesbians may not have even been in Lower Manhattan. His main focus is to tell the history of the homophile movement as it transformed into gay liberation, largely as a result of organizational work by 3 white gay men, whom he largely features. The actual uprising in this book occupies about 20 pages or so of just one chapter. Okay. Basically, according to him, the older homophile movement was fundamentally conservative, preferring calm, quiet actions like picketing and demanding that homosexuals present themselves as clean, well-dressed middle-class citizens. They even disallowed gay people from holding hands during a public protest. As younger people joined the ranks of the homophile movement, they felt pretty disaffected by these demands and sought a more radical approach to advocate for gay rights. When Stonewall happened, that younger vanguard used Stonewall as a rallying cry, and their efforts had a real and significant effect. Groups like the Mattachine Society effectively disbanded, but young gay rights advocates framed Stonewall as their origin story to create a specific new organization, the Gay Liberation Front. Simultaneously, white gay men who participated in the uprising began planning a march on the 1-year anniversary to commemorate it. This planned march was named the first annual Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade and was held on Sunday, June 28th, 1970. Using a network of gay rights organizations built on the bones of the Mattachine Society and Daughters of Bilitis, organizers in New York City coordinated with other groups nationwide. Los Angeles also held a Liberation Day Parade on June 28, 1970. This parade would be repeated in 1971, 72, 73. Over subsequent years, it transformed from the Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade to a commemoration of the Stonewall Uprising that went national and indeed international, and is the day of remembrance that we now call Pride. That's why June is Pride Month, or so the stories go. And actually, this history does go back before 1969 as well. The Mattachine Society through the 1960s was already sponsoring what they call their annual Reminder event, held each year on July 4th in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The Reminder is basically a nonviolent picketing event to literally remind people that homosexuals were, like, alive in this country and were not treated equally under the law. According to Duberman, the Reminder became the Liberation Day Parade and effectively kept moving forward, just with a slight change of dates, which is to say that Pride was born after Stonewall, but is actually built on foundations of early protests that preceded it, from the Mattachine Society's early days, but then radicalized as more young gay activists became involved. Duberman's history is incredibly compelling, and it's not wrong so much as it's incredibly too narrowly focused, and it has been roundly criticized, by the way, by other historians and scholars, even as it remains an important work in gay history. Duberman's main fault is twofold. First, he leans hard into the idea that Stonewall itself was not significant, except for the support network that surrounded it and helped organize events to commemorate it and establish its legacy. Second, his focus on organizational involvement leads him to tell the story of Stonewall primarily as a story about white gay men. And yes, frankly, white gay men made a massive difference at Stonewall and deserve credit for using their resources and organizational involvement to turn Stonewall into the symbol of LGBTQ rights it is today. But the queer community is somewhat more diverse than that, I say, with minor irony. When the origin story of our progress towards liberation becomes a story about white gay men, too easily other queer peoples get overlooked, forgotten, and uncredited for their substantial work as well. And in recent years, there has been a concerted effort by queer historians to tell fuller histories that highlight other groups and other peoples. Some of these efforts are laudable. Some are perpetuating myths that have grown out of Stonewall that the actual sort of objective reporting doesn't necessarily support. There are 2 movies about Stonewall. That delightfully campy 1995 BBC film that focused on drag queens and nods to racial diversity, but it's also relatively unknown. And then in 2015, director Roland Emmerich released the big budget Hollywood film Stonewall, to immediate and justified criticism that it profoundly whitewashes a great deal of Stonewall's story and erases many other queer peoples and communities involved. In particular, controversy about one key figure plagued that film, Marsha P. Johnson, the trans woman of color who invited Sylvia Rivera out to party that night. It is a common Pride Month Facebook meme to insist that Pride was a riot and that it was started by trans women as opposed to gay men. Particular credit is given to trans women of color. Johnson, along with Rivera, are key figures in these claims. The contemporary debate about origins has become so precise as to demand acknowledgement of who threw the first brick, or even who pushed the first police officer inside of the actual bar. Comedy Central, always a great source of information, in its popular online series called Drunk History, places Johnson in the bar, actually in the bar, as the first person to fight back against the police. This claim is somewhat undercut by Johnson's own insistence in interviews that she was not inside the bar when the first altercations occurred. She arrived later that night, after the uprising had started. It is, however, pretty likely that she did eventually throw some bricks at the cops, just throwing that out there. Certainly, on subsequent days of the uprising, evidence suggests that she was involved. Rivera insists that she was already in the bar, though actually Johnson would question that assertion in later interviews as well. In her own interviews, Rivera never claims to have fought cops in the bar, but she did participate in calling out the cops as part of the crowd outside of the bar once the cops had barricaded themselves inside of it. She also claimed in interviews that she was escorted politely out of the bar and under no threat of arrest per se that night. She had been arrested many times before by police in various raids. But she and others that were there that night, they were just tired of it. They were all there together. And it's that just being sick and tired of it that does emerge from all the stories who were there that night. In 2017, Netflix released the documentary, The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, a film that explored Johnson's mysterious death in 1992. But the film actually turns into something more than just a whodunit. By the end of the film, the main protagonist seems to be Sylvia Rivera, who, along with Johnson, founded STAR, a safe house network for trans youth in the aftermath of Stonewall. Both Johnson and Rivera were active members in the Gay Liberation Front, with Johnson often credited as a founding member of the Gay Liberation Front. Duberman gives some attention to these efforts, but his main focus is the Gay Liberation Front and its white male members. Johnson receives only scant mention in his book at all. Rivera's advocacy and legacy feels like a side story, really. The 2017 Netflix documentary helps rejuvenate the roles of both Johnson and Rivera, but neither were more central to Stonewall than anyone else. Perhaps Rivera's most famous legacy stems from when she left the Gay Liberation Front in 1973, and when, on her way out, she spoke at the 1973 Christopher Street Liberation Parade, where she absolutely excoriated the gathered crowd for its exclusion of trans women, imprisoned queer people, and other communities still marginalized, even within the broader gay liberation. And if you also want something else to watch tonight, you can find this speech on YouTube. Be warned, it's not PG-13. Other efforts to find a single source of what took place inside Stonewall that night leads to equally vexing controversies. One of the documented arrests that night was actually a straight man, Dave Van Ronk, who lived in the area, had long engaged in various political protests, quite simply heard the commotion going on down the street as the uprising gained momentum, and he decided to go down the street to see what was happening. Upon arriving at the Stonewall Inn, he was randomly grabbed by the cops, pulled into the bar where they had barricaded themselves, at which point he was beaten to near unconsciousness by the cops, who blamed him for throwing a coin that had hit a police officer and caused his eyebrow. And then he was subsequently one of the people arrested. He was one of the few non-employees of Stonewall arrested on June 28th. Yeah, a straight man. Nothing personal or anything here, but I wanted this to be a queer story. Duberman chooses a safe and likely accurate way to describe the first few moments that led to the altercations and uprising. He basically says that once the cops arrived in the bar, where they most certainly roughed up some folks. Probably several things happened more or less at once, with several queer people pushing back, resisting to various degrees, and otherwise refusing to go gently into that good night, and then into these waiting police vans outside. But one story in particular still echoes, the story of someone we might call the unknown lesbian. Generally speaking, the cops only arrested employees in raids on gay bars. However, as there were laws in New York City against cross-dressing, anyone in the bar that night who was dressed outside of the boundaries of traditional gender dress codes could have found themselves singled out for harassment, abuse, or arrest. According to eyewitnesses, one such person was a lesbian who presented as butch and wore masculine clothes. That a lesbian features in the story at all is significant. Most accounts of the usual clientele at Stonewall pretty clearly suggest it was not much of a lesbian bar. However, on June 28th, one lesbian who was in the bar was singled out. She was handcuffed and led to the waiting police van, the proverbial paddy wagon. When she complained the handcuffs they had placed on her were too tight, the police, quote, slapped her across the head with a nightstick, end quote. This moment, this particular violence, seems to have been very integral in making the crowd explode. In her young adult book, The Stonewall Riot, coming out in the streets, Gail E. Pittman expands on the story. Pittman claims this unknown lesbian was dragged out by force by the police, who then placed her in the paddy wagon, from which she escaped. She was then reapprehended, escaped again, and was reapprehended. Finally, yelling about the handcuffs being too tight, she was hit in the head with a nightstick. Now bleeding, but still fighting, she turned to the crowd and screamed, "Why don't you guys do something?" While she was forced back into the police van, that, according to many stories, is when the riot broke out. That moment when someone finally voiced that long repressed language of the unheard. In 1993, Duberman did not know the identity of this lesbian. Pittman, writing in 2019, explores the claim that this person was a mixed-race butch lesbian from New Orleans originally, named Stormy de Larverie. Stormy only came forward to claim that she was this unknown lesbian in 2008, long after Stonewall had gained legendary status as the origin moment for contemporary LGBTQ+ rights. Pittman politely accuses Stormy de Larverie of lying, of claiming many years later a fame that was probably untrue. Thus, Pittman claims the true identity of the lesbian hauled out and beaten that night remains a mystery. We know from multiple accounts that a butch-presenting lesbian was hauled out of the bar and hit with a nightstick. In the melee that was brewing, the crowd responded, though elsewhere on the street and in the bar, other confrontations were also erupting at the same time. The small events ultimately blur into a larger event. We are left unsure of so very much. I, for one, though, not just because I'm a Southerner at heart, but because I'm just thinking about the details of the story, I, for one, would actually argue in de Larverie's favor, at least if the only reason to discount her claims is that she waited so long to come forward. To presume that she would have immediately come forward, proud of her place in LGBTQ+ history, is to presume that she saw that one moment as central to greater LGBTQ+ history. What we might need to admit is that for many people in the United States, in New York City, and even in the Stonewall Inn in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, they didn't know they were making history. And for much of the country, and for many LGBTQ+ folks living in it, the progress represented by Stonewall would take many, many years to reach us. In fact, without historians and filmmakers, documentarians, Facebook memes, and drunk histories on Comedy Central, the vast majority of LGBTQ+ history, of our history, would actually probably still just be completely untold, would be relatively unknown, would be obscured by our continued reality that our gains cannot be taken for granted, and our lives, our loves, our rights are still under constant threat. Always get emotional when I think about this. As Stonewall has grown in the imagination of LGBTQ plus people, it has become both a common communal rallying cry and a contested space. It has grown to have meaning as an icon of progress. Simultaneously, fissures have emerged within the LGBT community about who has the most claim to its legacy and what rights the actual veterans of the Stonewall Inn were fighting for that night and in the years that have followed. And all this about a mob-owned gay bar built in what was originally a livery stable, which, as a side note, the Stonewall Inn had no running water. A bar with no running water. Hardly the kind of place that we should choose to exalt. Another young gay kid at Stonewall that night, Thomas Lanigan Schmidt, would later describe what happened this way. Quote, Mother Stonewall was being violated. They were forcibly entering her with nightsticks. The lights went on. It wasn't pretty. But, he continued, we already had our war wounds. So this was just another battle. Nobody thought of it as history, her story, my story, your story, or our story. We were being denied a place to dance together. That's all, end quote. Except that's not all. Or at least now, half a century later, we don't want it to be all. But in our search for the real story and our need to make it mean something more in history, we might occasionally be guilty of beating onward votes against the current, born that ceaselessly in search of a very obscure past. To see beyond Stonewall might require accepting the inconsistencies of the details and focusing instead on a bigger picture, that what matters most is that we rise up. Thank you.